Today, I'll be presenting on behalf of the UNFCCC Climate Champions. I'll be explaining the institution very quickly, the activities that we're doing specifically in road transport, and I'll be ending my presentation with a focus on COP27, what is happening, what are the priorities, and how does transport fit within it. It's going to be a big deal. So, and I'm talking less on my role as TfC. So, what is the Climate Champions? Well, we are a new organization. It started a couple of years ago as part of the Marrakesh Partnership. And 3 years ago, it started to convene a team that grew, most of us are secondees, to help the two high-level climate champions, Mr. Nigel Topping from last year's UK presidency and Dr. Mahmoud Mohideen from this year's Egyptian presidency, Rouad al-Munakh, to deliver through campaigns, stakeholder engagement, and system transformation. Our objective is to limit the temperature increase to 1.5, which is the lower bound of the Paris Agreement. We have multiple teams and minus sector transformation, specifically focusing on road transport. And our methodology is the ambition loop. The UNFCCC works with government actors, that means with states, and these are the ones that negotiate during COP. We focus on non-state actors, which are the companies, the corporates, cities, regional state governments, and try to increase their ambition vis-a-vis government policy, which in turn increases the ambition of non-state actors, creating this positively reinforcing ambition loop. It's a unique mandate for the climate champions because it's the only formal bridge between the formal parties, that is the states, and the non-state actors I mentioned. And the impact is really to try to use the spotlight of COP, the media attention, the convening power of bringing all of these together to make sure that climate action is happening all year long and not just during the 2 weeks of the COP. So when we talk about transport, I just put a list of key partners that we're engaging across policy, supply, demand, finance, and civil society. And we work through 3 main campaigns. The oldest one is in the middle, Race to Zero. And this is about getting the same non-state actors to commit to zero carbon emissions. And then we start figuring out how we achieve them. And today, more than 80% of global GDP, covering almost the same amount of emissions, are covered by a net zero target. A new campaign that is more relevant this year, and I'll come to the Egyptian COP presidency priorities, is the Race to Resilience. And resilience is a little bit like sustainability. A lot of people understand it from different perspectives, but a simple definition would be increasing the capacity of social, economic, and environmental systems to withstand climate change, while at the same time allowing it to adapt. The campaign aims to increase the resilience of 4 billion people. And in transport, what this means is the resilience to extreme heat. In some countries, we've seen asphalt melt. To weather. In Egypt, we have seen flash flooding in the winter, and to rising sea levels. And finally, there is GFANS, which is the Financial Alliance of Non-State Actors. And this one helps get the entire value chain of banks, insurance companies, financial service providers to have the same net zero standards, commitments, and work to them. And in Glasgow, they achieved 130 trillion worth of institutions to agree to GFANS, covering basically a quarter of the money that exists in the world to invest. Now, if we go from these 3 campaigns that we're working on with a focus on road transport, and I'm still talking on the global level more, there are some challenges that we face. One of them is related to just transition. Last year, there was a focus on the end of ICE, internal combustion engines, and a full dedication to zero emission vehicles, be them electric or hydrogen or other. But there is a dumping risk once you get these targets in developed markets and then you basically have to see the second-hand vehicles come to emerging markets. The labor market is a huge issue because when you have an informal sector dominated public transport system like in Egypt or all of Africa basically, or 50% of the people traveling every day use the informal sector, what about the workers of this sector? Mobility needs to provide accessibility to opportunities and services. It needs to be affordable, safe, but yet focusing on the vehicles, as in the zero emission vehicles, is a risk. And finally, how do we fund that, especially in a context of increasing public and private debts and market mechanisms that are not working? So what we are doing in the Climate Champions is focusing on Transport Day and how we can leverage it with the partners across the 5 categories I mentioned: policy, supply, demand, finance, and working on these 2 sector breakthroughs. And I'll explain the sector breakthrough concept in a moment. The first one has been announced last year, and it is the end of ICE, the end of internal combustion engines. It's about creating a new narrative of mobility. What is good mobility? And it's about marshalling financing and creating new investment vehicles in support of the sector breakthrough. So what is the sector breakthrough? This is an explanation of last year's one, which is the end of ICE, which basically says we want 100% of buses by 2030 to be electric, 100% of passenger vehicles and vans by 2035, and 100% by 2040. Now, these specific targets were set in motion by the Marrakesh Partnership, and they're getting changed over time. There will be a report coming up in a couple of weeks' time, putting the updated targets for 2020. But I think that the essence is that the industry is changing, and we can see this in Europe, for instance. Electric vehicles and hybrids are almost going to exceed sales of internal combustion engines this year. And this will scale to other countries. In China, also, the momentum is very fast. And it's really about the concept of an S-curve. Because when we start today slowly, an S-curve means that at some point there will be a tipping point in which the change is happening faster than the old technology. And this is what we're trying to bring forward. And this year, the Climate Champions are working on creating a second sector breakthrough, one that focuses more on a wider space of climate actions in transport. We want to avoid movement, which is a mitigation effort, travel smaller distances. We want to shift to cleaner modes, which is what zero emission vehicles are really about. It's about using an electric car that doesn't emit tailpipe versus a petrol or diesel bus that does emit, which is also mitigation. But we need to start thinking about adaptation. We need to start thinking about the resilience of the system. And we need to think about a target that achieves such as S-curve, because this is what makes our investment worthwhile. It makes it tangible. And we're still developing it. We haven't yet decided, but hopefully it will be published along this year within a couple of weeks as well. Now, this is the latest version of the COP presidency agenda that we have and the kind of topics that we have. And we see that transport is not there directly, different from last year's. But we're still developing the narrative for this year's COPs, which is emerging, because it will talk about finance. And this is a key issue if we want to achieve the targets that the Race to Zero campaign has gotten a lot of the industry behind. How are we going to pay for it? We need to think about adaptation. How do we adapt the existing and the new infrastructure to a changing climate? It's very much about decarbonization, and it's very much about energy. And it's very much about coming up with tangible solutions, tangible projects that can be implemented. So we see that transport fits within multiple of the COP Presidency Days narratives. And to end, we know the 5 priorities of the Egyptian COP presidency, and we know the sustainable transport narrative of Egypt on the right side, which is what I will be presenting here. COP27 will really focus on implementation. The previous COPs were normally about negotiation to arrive at common targets. COP26 in Glasgow last year was the first one that was really focused on action. And the Egyptian one is taking it with the view of the emerging world. It's the first one that focuses on action on the emerging world. It's really about having a holistic approach that takes into account all dimensions of climate actions and the sustainable development goals. We need to remember like the excellent work that the Ministry of International Cooperation did, mapping all of our development assistance onto the sustainable development goals. Is the same with climate actions. We cannot just work to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions that emerging countries haven't been the primarily cause of, and we need to think about how it fits into sustainable development. It's about a just transition. It's about jobs and growth and resilience and adaptation. It takes us very much to finance and investments. How do we pay for these, and how do we marshal the investments that allow us to develop while having a holistic implementation of climate actions? The focus is on emerging markets. Some people call it the African COP. And it's about bringing in non-state actors and giving them a bigger role. And if we look about what's been happening in Egypt, we see that there's a lot of really interesting things that will be showcased, discussed, and built upon. Egypt is increasing its electric rail infrastructure at a scale of increase that's probably among the biggest in the world, in between the new Siemens railway network, which will cover not just high-speed rail, but also regional commuter rails and freight transport. It's supposed to increase freight on rails from 1% to 15% of total freight carried. We have a lot of work in electric buses, the focus on today's webinar, specifically a pilot that's been running in Alexandria 3 years ago, a much bigger pilot, the biggest in Africa, which will launch this summer in the Greater Cairo region, and a pledge that 160 e-buses will be launched in Sharm el-Sheikh, turning its full network electric buses, and it will be the first such city in Africa with 100% e-bus system during COP and onwards. The monorails that we see in New Cairo and 6th of October have been financed by green bonds and are really a big learning lesson of how to marshal finance and investments, and the good parts and the difficult parts. And finally, it's about what are the next steps? How do we projectize a lot of these high ambitions that we have? And this is where I thank you and end my presentation. Thank you very much.